Chapter 6. Beginning of the Peloponnesian War. First invasion of Attica. Funeral oration of Pericles. The war between the Athenians and Peloponnesians and the allies on either side now really begins. For now all intercourse except through the medium of heralds ceased, and hostilities were commenced and prosecuted without intermission. The history follows the chronological order of events by summers and winters. The 30 years' truce, which was entered into after the conquest of Euboea, lasted 14 years. In the 15th, in the 48th year of the priestessship of Chrysis at Argos, in the ephorate of Anicius at Sparta, in the last month but 2 of the archonship of Pythodorus at Athens, and 6 months after the battle of Potidaea, just at the beginning of spring, a Theban force a little over 300 strong, under the command of their Boeotarchs, Pythangelus, son of Philedes, and Diemporus, son of Onotores, about the first watch of the night, made an armed entry into Plataea, a town of Boeotia in alliance with Athens. The gates were opened to them by a Plataean called Naucleides, who, with his party, had invited them in, meaning to put to death the citizens of the opposite party, bring over the city to Thebes, and thus obtain power for themselves. This was arranged through Eurymachus, son of Leontiades, a person of great influence at Thebes. For Plataea had always been at variance with Thebes, and the latter, foreseeing that war was at hand, wished to surprise her old enemy in time of peace, before hostilities had actually broken out. Indeed, this was how they got in so easily without being observed, as no guard had been posted. After the soldiers had grounded arms in the marketplace, those who had invited them in wished them to set to work at once and go to their enemies' houses. This, however, the Thebans refused to do, but determined to make a conciliatory proclamation, and if possible, to come to a friendly understanding with the citizens. Their herald accordingly invited any who wished to resume their old place in the confederacy of their countrymen to ground arms with them, for they thought that in this way the city would readily join them. On becoming aware of the presence of the Thebans within their gates and of the sudden occupation of the town, the Plataeans concluded in their alarm that more had entered than was really the case, the night preventing their seeing them. They accordingly came to terms and, accepting the proposal, made no movement, especially as the Thebans offered none of them any violence. But somehow or other, during the negotiations, they discovered the scanty numbers of the Thebans and decided that they could easily attack and overpower them, the mass of the Plataeans being averse to revolting from Athens. At all events, they resolved to attempt it. Digging through the party walls of the houses, they thus managed to join each other without being seen going through the streets, in which they placed wagons without the beasts in them to serve as a barricade, and arranged everything else as seemed convenient for the occasion. When everything had been done that circumstances permitted, they watched their opportunity and went out of their houses against the enemy. It was still night, though daybreak was at hand. In daylight, it was thought that their attack would be met by men full of courage and on equal terms with their assailants, while in darkness it would fall upon panic-stricken troops who would also be at a disadvantage from their enemies' knowledge of the locality. So they made their assault at once and came to close quarters as quickly as they could. The Thebans, finding themselves outwitted, immediately closed up to repel all attacks made upon them. Twice or thrice they beat back their assailants, but the men shouted and charged them, the women and slaves screamed and yelled from the houses, and pelted them with stones and tiles. Besides, it had been raining hard all night, and so, at last, their courage gave way, and they turned and fled through the town. Most of the fugitives were quite ignorant of the right ways out, and this, with the mud and the darkness caused by the moon being in her last quarter, and the fact that their pursuers knew their way about and could easily stop their escape, proved fatal to many. The only gate open was the one by which they had entered, and this was shut by one of the Plataeans driving the spike of a javelin into the bar instead of the bolt, so that even here there was no longer any means of exit. They were now chased all over the town. Some got on the wall and threw themselves over, in most cases with a fatal result. One party managed to find a deserted gate, and obtaining an axe from a woman, cut through the bar. But as they were soon observed, only a few succeeded in getting out. Others were cut off in detail in different parts of the city. The most numerous and compact body rushed into a large building next to the city wall. The doors on the side of the street happened to be open, and the Thebans fancied that they were the gates of the town, and that there was a passage right through to the outside. The Plataeans, seeing their enemies in a trap, now consulted whether they should set fire to the building and burn them just as they were, or whether there was anything else that they could do with them. Until at length these and the rest of the Theban survivors, found wandering about the town, agreed to an unconditional surrender of themselves and their arms to the Plataeans. While such was the fate of the party in Plataea, the rest of the Thebans who were to have joined them with all their forces before dawn, in case of anything miscarrying with the body that had entered, received the news of the affair on the road, and pressed forward to their succor. Now Plataea is nearly 8 miles from Thebes, and their march delayed by the rain that had fallen in the night, for the river Asopus had risen and was not easy of passage, and so, having to march in the rain, and being hindered in crossing the river, they arrived too late, and found the whole party either slain or captive. When they learned what had happened, they at once formed a design against the Plataeans outside the city. As the attack had been made in time of peace and was perfectly unexpected, there were of course men and stock in the fields, and the Thebans wished, if possible, to have some prisoners to exchange against their countrymen in the town, should any chance to have been taken alive. Such was their plan. But the Plataeans suspected their intention almost before it was formed, and becoming alarmed for their fellow citizens outside the town, sent a herald to the Thebans, reproaching them for their unscrupulous attempt to seize their city in time of peace, and warning them against any outrage on those outside. Should the warning be disregarded, they threatened to put to death the men they had in their hands, but added that on the Thebans retiring from their territory, they would surrender the prisoners to their friends. This is the Theban account of the matter, and they say that they had an oath given them. The Plataeans, on the other hand, do not admit any promise of an immediate surrender, but make it contingent upon subsequent negotiation. The oath they deny altogether. Be this as it may, upon the Thebans retiring from their territory without committing any injury, the Plataeans hastily got in whatever they had in the country and immediately put the men to death. The prisoners were 180 in number, Eurymachus, the person with whom the traitors had negotiated, being one. This done, the Plataeans sent a messenger to Athens, gave back the dead to the Thebans under a truce, and arranged things in the city as seemed best to meet the present emergency. The Athenians, meanwhile, having had word of the affair sent them immediately after its occurrence, had instantly seized all the Boeotians in Attica, and sent a herald to the Plataeans to forbid their proceeding to extremities with their Theban prisoners without instructions from Athens. The news of the men's death had of course not arrived, the first messenger having left Plataea just when the Thebans entered it, the second just after their defeat and capture, so there was no later news. Thus the Athenians sent orders in ignorance of the facts, and the herald on his arrival found the men slain. After this the Athenians marched to Plataea and brought in provisions and left a garrison in the place, also taking away the women and children and such of the men as were least efficient. After the affair at Plataea, the treaty had been broken by an overt act, and Athens at once prepared for war, as did also Lacedaemon and her allies. They resolved to send embassies to the king and to such other of the barbarian powers as either party could look to for assistance, and try to ally themselves with the independent states at home. Lacedaemon, in addition to the existing marine, gave orders to the states that had declared for her in Italy and Sicily to build vessels up to a grand total of 500, the quota of each city being determined by its size, and also to provide a specified sum of money. Till these were ready, they were to remain neutral and to admit single Athenian ships into their harbors. Athens, on her part, reviewed her existing confederacy and sent embassies to the places more immediately round Peloponnese, Corcyra, Cephallenia, Acarnania, and Zacynthus, perceiving that if these could be relied on, she could carry the war all around Peloponnese. And if both sides nourished the boldest hopes and put forth their utmost strength for the war, this was only natural. Zeal is always at its height at the commencement of an undertaking, and on this particular occasion, Peloponnese and Athens were both full of young men, whose inexperience made them eager to take up arms, while the rest of Hellas stood straining with excitement at the conflict of its leading cities. Everywhere predictions were being recited and oracles being chanted by such persons as collect them, and this not only in the contending cities. Further, some while before this, there was an earthquake at Delos for the first time in the memory of the Hellenes. This was said and thought to be ominous of the events impending. Indeed, nothing of the kind that happened was allowed to pass without remark. The good wishes of men made greatly for the Lacedaemonians, especially as they proclaimed themselves the liberators of Hella. No private or public effort that could help them in speech or action was omitted, each thinking that the cause suffered where he could not himself see to it. So general was the indignation felt against Athens, whether by those who wished to escape from her empire or were apprehensive of being absorbed by it. Such were the preparations and such the feelings with which the contest opened. The allies of the two belligerents were the following. These were the allies of Lacedaemon.
There was a trifling affair at Phrygia between a squadron of the Athenian horse with the Thessalians and the Boeotian cavalry, in which the former had rather the best of it, until the heavy infantry advanced to the support of the Boeotians, when the Thessalians and Athenians were routed and lost a few men, whose bodies, however, were recovered the same day without a truce. The next day the Peloponnesians set up a trophy. Ancient alliance brought the Thessalians to the aid of Athens, those who came being the Larisseans, Pharsalians, Cranonians, Pyrrhosians, Girtonians, and Pharaians. The Larissean commanders were Palamedes and Aristanes, two party leaders in Larissa. The Pharsalian general was Menon. Each of the other cities had also its own commander. In the meantime, the Peloponnesians, as the Athenians did not come out to engage them, broke up from Acharnae and ravaged some of the demes between Mount Parnes and Brelessus. While they were in Attica, the Athenians sent off the 100 ships which they had been preparing round Peloponnese, with 1,000 heavy infantry and 400 archers on board, under the command of Carcinus, son of Xenotimus, Proteus, son of Epicles, and Socrates, son of Antigenes. This armament weighed anchor and started on its cruise, and the Peloponnesians, after remaining in Attica as long as their provisions lasted, retired through Boeotia by a different road to that by which they had entered. As they passed Oropus, they ravaged the territory of Graea, which is held by the Oropians from Athens, and reaching Peloponnese broke up to their respective cities. After they had retired, the Athenians set guards by land and sea at the points at which they intended to have regular stations during the war. They also resolved to set apart a special fund of 1,000 talents from the monies in the Acropolis. This was not to be spent, but the current expenses of the war were to be otherwise provided for. If anyone should move or put to the vote a proposition for using the money for any purpose whatever, except that of defending the city in the event of the enemy bringing a fleet to make an attack by sea, it should be a capital offense. With this sum of money, they also set aside a special fleet of 100 galleys, the best ships of each year, with their captains. None of these were to be used except with the money and against the same peril, should such peril arise. Meanwhile, the Athenians in the 100 ships round Peloponnese, reinforced by a Corcyraean squadron of 50 vessels and some others of the allies in those parts, cruised about the coasts and ravaged the country. Among other places, they landed in Laconia and made an assault upon Methone, there being no garrison in the place and the wall being weak. But it so happened that Brasidas, son of Tellus, a Spartan, was in command of a guard for the defense of the district. Hearing of the attack, he hurried with 100 heavy infantry to the assistance of the besieged, and, dashing through the army of the Athenians, which was scattered over the country and had its attention turned to the wall, threw himself into Methone. He lost a few men in making good his entrance, but saved the place and won the thanks of Sparta by his exploit, being thus the first officer who obtained this notice during the war. The Athenians at once weighed anchor and continued their cruise. Touching at Phia in Elis, they ravaged the country for 2 days and defeated a picked force of 300 men that had come from the valley of Elis and the immediate neighborhood to the rescue. But a stiff squall came down upon them, and, not liking to face it in a place where there was no harbor, most of them got on board their ships, and doubling Point Ichthys sailed into the port of Phia. In the meantime, the Messenians, and some others who could not get on board, marched over by land and took Phia. The fleet afterwards sailed round and picked them up, and then put to sea, Phia being evacuated, as the main army of the Eleans had now come up. The Athenians continued their cruise and ravaged other places on the coast. About the same time, the Athenians sent 30 ships to cruise around Locris and also to guard Euboea, Cleopompus, son of Clinias, being in command. Making descents from the fleet, he ravaged certain places on the seacoast and captured Thronium and took hostages from it. He also defeated at Alope the Locrians that had assembled to resist him. During the summer, the Athenians also expelled the Aeginetans with their wives and children from Aeginae, on the ground of their having been the chief agents in bringing the war on them. Besides, Aeginae lies so near Peloponnese that it seemed safer to send colonists of their own to hold it, and shortly afterwards the settlers were sent out. The banished Aeginetans found an asylum in Thurea, which was given to them by Lacedaemon, not only on account of her quarrel with Athens, but also because the Aeginetans had laid her under obligations at the time of the earthquake and the revolt of the Helots. The territory of Thurea is on the frontier of Argolis and Laconia, reaching down to the sea. Those of the Aeginetans who did not settle here were scattered over the rest of Hellas. The same summer, at the beginning of a new lunar month, the only time, by the way, at which it appears possible, the sun was eclipsed after noon. After it had assumed the form of a crescent and some of the stars had come out, it returned to its natural shape. During the same summer, Nymphodorus, son of Pythes, an Abderite, whose sister Ctacus had married, was made their proxenus by the Athenians and sent for to Athens. They had hitherto considered him their enemy, but he had great influence with Ctacus, and they wished this prince to become their ally. Ctacus was the son of Terus and king of the Thracians. Terus, the father of Ctacus, was the first to establish the great kingdom of the Odrysians on a scale quite unknown to the rest of Thrace, a large portion of the Thracians being independent. This Terus is in no way related to Tereus, who married Pandion's daughter Procne from Athens, nor indeed did they belong to the same part of Thrace. Terus lived in Daulis, part of what is now called Phocis, but which at that time was inhabited by Thracians. It was in this land that the women perpetrated the outrage upon Aede, and many of the poets, when they mention the nightingale, call it the Daulian bird. Besides, Pandion, in contracting an alliance for his daughter, would consider the advantages of mutual assistance, and would naturally prefer a match at the above moderate distance to the journey of many days which separates Athens from the Odrysians. Again, the names are different, and this Terus was king of the Odrysians, the first, by the way, who attained to any power. Ctacus, his son, was now sought as an ally by the Athenians, who desired his aid in the reduction of the Thracian towns and of Perdiccas. Coming to Athens, Nymphodorus concluded the alliance with Ctacus and made his son Sodicus an Athenian citizen, and promised to finish the war in Thrace by persuading Ctacus to send the Athenians a force of Thracian horse and targeteers. He also reconciled them with Perdiccas and induced them to restore Therme to him, upon which Perdiccas at once joined the Athenians and Phormio in an expedition against the Chalcidians. Thus, Ctacus, son of Terus, king of the Thracians, and Perdiccas, son of Alexander, king of the Macedonians, became allies of Athens. Meanwhile, the Athenians in the 100 vessels were still cruising round Peloponnese. After taking Solium, a town belonging to Corinth, and presenting the city and territory to the Acarnanians of Palmyra, they stormed Astacus, expelled its tyrant Evarchus, and gained the place for their confederacy. Next, they sailed to the island of Cephallenia and brought it over without using force. Cephallenia lies off Acarnania and Leucas, and consists of 4 states, the Pallians, Crononians, Samaeans, and Praenaeans. Not long afterwards, the fleet returned to Athens. Towards the autumn of this year, the Athenians invaded the Megarod with their whole levy, resident aliens included, under the command of Pericles, son of Xanthippus. The Athenians in the 100 ships round Peloponnese on their journey home had just reached Aeginae, and hearing that the citizens at home were in full force at Megara, now sailed over and joined them. This was without doubt the largest army of Athenians ever assembled, the state being still in the flower of her strength and yet unvisited by the plague. Full 10,000 heavy infantry were in the field, all Athenian citizens, besides the 3,000 before Potidaea. Then, the resident aliens who joined in the incursion were at least 3,000 strong, besides which there was a multitude of light troops. They ravaged the greater part of the territory and then retired. Other incursions into the Megara were afterwards made by the Athenians annually during the war, sometimes only with cavalry, sometimes with all their forces. This went on until the capture of Nicaea. Atalanta also, the deserted island off the Opuntian coast, was towards the end of this summer converted into a fortified post by the Athenians, in order to prevent privateers issuing from Opus and the rest of Locris and plundering Euboea. Such were the events of this summer after the return of the Peloponnesians from Attica. In the ensuing winter, the Acarnanian Avarchus, wishing to return to Astacus, persuaded the Corinthians to sail over with 40 ships and 1,500 heavy infantry and restore him, himself also hiring some mercenaries. In command of the force were Euphamidas, son of Aristonomus, Timoxenus, son of Timocrates, and Eumachus, son of Chryses, who sailed over and restored him, and, after failing in an attempt on some places on the Acarnanian coast which they were desirous of gaining, began their voyage home. Coasting along shore, they touched at Cephallenia and made a descent on the Cranian territory, and, losing some men by the treachery of the Cranians, who fell suddenly upon them after having agreed to treat, put to sea somewhat hurriedly and returned home. In the same winter, the Athenians gave a funeral at the public cost to those who had first fallen in this war. It was a custom of their ancestors, and the manner of it is as follows. 3 days before the ceremony, the bones of the dead are laid out in a tent which has been erected, and their friends bring to their relatives such offerings as they please. In the funeral procession, Kuiper's coffins are borne in cars, one for each tribe, the bones of the deceased being placed in the coffin of their tribe. Among these is carried one empty bier decked for the missing, that is, for those whose bodies could not be recovered. Any citizen or stranger who pleases